Good afternoon. My name is Greg Krasovsky. I'm an American and a Russian attorney of Ukrainian descent. The subject of today's video is defending the rights of military prisoners, prisoners of war, in the current Ukrainian-Russian conflict. After the start of Russia's what's called special military operation, I think the full name is Special Military Operation to defend the residents of the Donetsk Coal Basin, including the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Regardless of what you call it, and people call it different names, whether it's a war or invasion, we're not going to comment on that. In a conflict like this, we've already seen prisoners of war. Prisoners of war from the Ukrainian side, Ukrainian soldiers, members of the Ukrainian National Guard, members of the Ukrainian territorial defense units that were set up under legislation passed by President Zelensky after the start of the conflict on February 24th. We've also seen Russian prisoners of war, Russian soldiers, members of Russia's National Guard and other units, as well as soldiers from the militias or the armies of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. I'm of Ukrainian descent on my mother's side. First 4 years of my life I've spent in Ukraine, Lugansk region. Obviously this is a heartbreaking conflict for me. I wish it never happened, but it has. My approach is very straightforward. And this is the approach that I demand from all of my colleagues that I work with, lawyers in Russia and Ukraine, on these cases involving prisoners of war and involving war crimes and crimes against humanity. Any prisoner of war deserves to be treated humanely and with respect, and in accordance with the defense afforded him, with the rights afforded him by the Geneva Convention and other international and domestic laws. To make it simple, once someone is captured as a prisoner of war, whether they surrender or they're captured by opposing forces, or for instance they've been wounded and left helpless, immobile, or unconscious on the battlefield, and they're taken prisoner of war, they deserve to be treated safely, humanely. If they need medical care has to be provided to them. They must be provided with adequate food, water, shelter, clothing. They must be provided with an opportunity to be seen by representatives of the International Committee of the Red Cross, if those representatives are available to see them. And that opportunity must not be withheld. In my opinion, they also deserve to be given an opportunity to call, to contact their relatives, right? Their loved ones. And if those can be found, at least, their military commanders and officials. So people can be notified that they're safe and they're alive. Prisoners of war should not be harshly treated, beaten, tortured, or killed, period. There's no justification to do it. Obviously, as people say, easier said than done. Everyone uses the same examples. Well, what happens if we capture a sniper who's just killed, 5 or 10 or however many of our fellow soldiers, in our squad or in our unit? We're not going to let this guy now surrender peacefully now that he's run out of ammunition or has been wounded or. Well, guess what, folks? Once a person no longer presents a threat to you and is surrendering voluntarily, or you've been able to capture him, you cannot take the law into your own hands. You're not the judge, jury, and executioner. And if you think you are, and if that's what you've done, then you've committed a war crime and you deserve punishment to the full extent of the law, right? Which in some countries includes lifelong imprisonment or capital punishment, execution, whether it's by firing squad, hanging, electric chair, or lethal ejection, or in some places even beheading, right? It doesn't matter. human life is sacred, and prisoners of war must be treated humanely. We don't want to hear excuses. Well, we didn't feel it was safe for us to take this prisoner of war. He would have slowed us down, or then, could have compromised our safety, or it just would have been inconvenient, would have slowed us down, and then we'd have to share limited resources with the prisoner of war. What can I tell you? Treat people like you want to be treated yourself. If you yourself have a sadomasochistic suicidal death wish and you don't want to be taken prisoner, that's on you. That's your choice. But you can't treat other people that way. So, for those people involved in this conflict who speak English and are able to understand what I'm saying now, if you become a witness or a participant, whether unwitting or forced participant, to improper treatment of prisoners of war, beatings, maimings, torture, killings, deprivation of food, water, sleep, other forms of torture or interrogation that are inappropriate, as they call enhanced interrogation techniques. Your job is to make it known that you object. Object. If you believe that objecting is going to compromise your safety, that your comrades at arms are going to now kill you because you're concerned about the rights of your enemy, what can I tell you? Then your option is report it up the chain of command. If you haven't been able to report it up the chain of command, you're unwilling to, then contact my law offices, and we will try to make the report, make sure you are afforded treatment as a protected whistleblower, if that's possible. So, in other words, to protect your rights and health and safety, and make the report to bring those who are committing these war crimes against prisoners of war to justice. That simple. So, if someone that you know or you suspect may have become a prisoner of war, may have been become a prisoner of war, let's say, with the Ukrainian armed forces or with Russian armed forces. In other words, if someone's in the custody of the government of Ukraine and its armed forces, or someone's in the custody of Russia and armed forces, as well as the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics that are allied with Russia, contact us. And I'll make sure my colleagues and I, when I say my colleagues and I, lawyers that I work with on a regular basis in Ukraine and in Russia, will make a concerted effort to try to protect that person. Also make sure that he's able to communicate, he or she, with their loved ones and with their commanders and the representatives of their government, as well as the Red Cross or other human rights organizations that have the authority to help prisoners of war or can bring their plight to the world's attention. That's it. Speaking of who's afforded protections under the Geneva Conventions, because we have regular combatants, soldiers who are within existing, defined, authorized military units who are acting under orders, under oath. Then we also have members of law enforcement who are involved in a conflict or who are taking part in active military operations. Police, National Guard. We also have, aside from the police and National Guard, we have security units, whether Ukraine Security Service or Russian Security Services. Another category that can become, and I would arguably say a prisoner of war, are first responders. For instance, people within the fire service, firemen, fire rescue, emergency medical services, ambulance personnel, or military medical personnel, or civilian personnel who've been, I guess you can call it drafted, but requested to provide medical services within military units. I believe all these individuals must be afforded protection and must be given fair and humane treatment equal to that of prisoners of war, if not more so, because they're civilians. So If you know anyone who's in that category, people who were providing medical treatment, people who were distributing humanitarian aid, food, water, medicine, other disaster relief supplies, people who were putting out fires, basically providing fire rescue services, those people deserve protection. And if you believe they've been captured or detained, or have become a de facto prisoner of war, contact my law offices. We'll try to help them. It's our job to protect everyone, regardless of what side there are on the conflict. I've also made a Russian language video on this topic. In that video, I mentioned a couple of episodes that are just a good or a bad example of what's happening in this conflict. We've seen videos where certain military commanders, certain soldiers, and sadly on the Ukrainian side, have said, we're not going to take prisoners of war. I think there was also a video where either a soldier from DNR or LNR or the Russian armed forces said something like that we don't intend to take prisoners. My approach is as follows. If this was said in fact, and it's true, then that's inappropriate. And not taking prisoners constitutes a war crime. You're not the judge, jury, and executioner, as I've said before. Regardless of the horrific things that the people who you're taking or you need to take prisoner of war have done. If you believe these people have inappropriately detained, kidnapped, used civilians as human shields, beat, tortured, raped, whatever, these people will get justice, but it has to be done properly. I'm sure that as this conflict goes on or after it ends, there'll be an opportunity to prosecute people for war crimes. They'll be prosecuted properly. They'll also be afforded proper legal defense. Anyone who's accused of a crime should have legal representation so they can provide their side of the story. The burden of proof is on the prosecution, as always. Obviously, in war times, it's difficult to get witnesses, physical evidence, maybe even the circumstantial evidence is circumspect. But those are the issues that will be dealt with from a procedural point of view later on. You don't take the law into your own hands and get to decide whether you should take prisoners of war or not. We've seen videos where Ukrainian soldiers or paramilitaries have maimed, shot, executed Russian soldiers on video. Obviously, it's evil, disgusting, inappropriate, conduct unbecoming any normal combatant. These people deserve to be brought to justice, okay? Regardless of whether you think that Russian soldiers have invaded your land or whatever. In military conflicts, this is what happens all the time, right? The two sides always fight on someone's territory, either their own or someone else's. So if you're fighting on someone else's territory, you can be considered an invader. If you're fighting on your own territory, well, then I guess you're considered a defender. Unless it's a civil war kind of conflict. That's not the point. These are issues that should not affect everyone's responsibility to protect prisoners of war and not to commit war crimes and to report war crimes against prisoners of war. There was also a video where a Ukrainian physician said that Russian soldiers should be treated like people. They're not people and they should be castrated. Well, that physician needs to be removed, right, from whatever work he's doing, investigated, and prosecuted. And probably have his medical license suspended, if not withdrawn, and terminated. Because as a doctor, you take the Hippocratic oath, right, to treat everyone. even if you have to treat criminals, even if you have to treat war criminals or enemy combatants. That's your responsibility as a medic, right? As a medical provider, whether you're a physician, a physician's assistant, a nurse, a paramedic, or whoever else. And if you're not able to do that, then this is not the job you should have. In civilian life, this is equally applicable, for instance, to police. Police are often accused of brutality, right? Of excessive use of force. And police will try to justify by saying, this criminal did horrible things. We had no choice. You did have a choice, right? You're not the judge and jury and executioner. You should use the minimal force required to detain someone or to neutralize them so they're no longer a threat. And then you have to let the criminal justice system do its work. In military conflicts, let the military justice system do its work. So, if you know anyone who is a potential victim of abuse of their rights as a prisoner of war or war crimes, please let us know. We'll have a separate video on victims of war crimes, by the way. The other issue in terms of who qualifies for protections afforded to prisoners of war, we have now foreigners entering this conflict. Mostly, from what I understand, on the Ukrainian side. Foreigners who have come to Ukraine to volunteer. Even under apparently Ukrainian government, not apparently, but Ukrainian government has passed legislation allowing foreigners to serve in the armed services of Ukraine. My advice to people like this is, look, if it's not your conflict, it's not your conflict. Unless you're a citizen of Ukraine or a citizen of Russia or Donetsk, Lugansk People's Republics, stay out of it. Stay out of it. Foreign soldiers, combatants, mercenaries, whatever you call them, volunteers, always try to serve and they justify it with good intentions. I wanted to protect the people of Ukraine, or I want to protect the people of blah, 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 whatever country that they decide to fight in. It's not your conflict. If you're captured by the other side, and the other side says, well, what were you doing in the battlefield? You may not be treated as a prisoner of war. You still deserve the same treatment, but later on, when prisoners of war are released, you may not be released. You may be tried as a foreign combatant. So it's not worth it. But let's make sure that if you know someone who made the decision, in my opinion, it's a mistaken decision, but it's not up to me to judge people's actions or motives. If you know someone who is a foreign combatant on Ukrainian soil and who has become a prisoner of war, contact my law offices, and my colleagues and I in Ukraine and in Russia will try to make sure that that person is afforded all the protections he's entitled to under the law. It's as simple as that. So let's pray that this conflict ends as quickly as possible with minimal loss of life, minimal suffering on both sides, and minimal destruction of infrastructure. We'll be glad to help people who have loved ones who become prisoners of war.